To introduce our speaker today, Angela Blackwell is a graduate of Howard University in Washington, D.C., and received her law degree from the University of California at Berkeley School of Law, Boalt Hall. She spent 10 years at Public Advocates, a nationally known public interest law firm committed to defending the rights of the legally underrepresented. In 1987, Ms. Blackwell founded the Urban Strategies Council in Oakland, California, where she presently serves as executive director. The Council is a nonprofit public policy organization that does a variety of things, publishes data to inform policy development, brings together policymakers, policy implementers, and target groups, and raises money to initiate strategies to combat persistent poverty. The Council also staffs the Commission for Positive Change in the Oakland Public Schools, which Ms. Blackwell co-chairs. The Commission has as its primary focus the development of an equitable school system that serves all of Oakland's youth well. Ms. Blackwell also travels nationally to serve on the boards of Children Now, Children's Policy Council, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Foundation for Child Development, the James Irvine Foundation, the National Civic League, Poverty and Race Research Action Council, Public-Private Ventures, and the Urban Institute. And we're grateful that she's traveled here to Portland today. City Club has invited Ms. Blackwell to address us about the model of advocacy which she has established in Oakland to consider its application to Portland. Please join me in welcoming Angela Blackwell to the podium.
Good afternoon, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to come here to the City Club to talk about how we combat persistent urban poverty and how it is that we can ensure that our children lead healthy and productive lives. It is a very important issue, and it's going to become more important as time goes by and we find that we have fewer and fewer resources, and we have to begin to make some hard, informed choices about how to utilize them. I want to begin by describing some of the challenges that we're facing here, some of our inadequacies in terms of how we've been responding to the crisis, and then talk about the work of the Urban Strategies Council. Although America is facing many tough problems around the globe, its most pressing and threatening issues are right here at home. The bedrock of this country is indeed being threatened by its inability to deal with the problem of long-term poverty and the absence of opportunity for many. And the minute you begin to talk about long-term or persistent poverty, you are beginning a discussion about children, because it is that cycle of poverty, that beginning again with the children, that makes poverty so long-term. There are at least three things that are contributing heavily to what I call a crisis, and the crisis has not to do with the numbers. We probably have, not probably, we do, have fewer people in poverty today than we have had at other times in our history. What makes it a crisis is that it is so difficult now to get out of poverty. And the three things that are contributing to that crisis are, one, the changing occupational landscape in this country, the isolation of those most at risk from long-term poverty from society's mainstream, and this country's ineptness in dealing with issues of race and ethnicity. America's occupational landscape has changed dramatically. It used to be that if you finished high school not very well prepared or dropped out of high school, you could expect to get a good job, make decent wages, get good benefits, put children through college even, and expect them to do well. That's no longer the case. Those jobs are not here in the numbers that they once were. It's not that they don't exist at all, but they're not here. They've moved outside of the country. And we have left in this country the need to be able to fill jobs with people who are skilled and well-educated. It's important to note that the future workforce of America is going to be black and brown. And if poverty, the absence of access to really high-quality institutions continues, and people continue who are black and brown to live in poverty, we have a future in which there's going to be a devastating mismatch between the future workforce and future jobs. Clearly, public schools could play a big part in closing this gap. But to respond, our public schools have to do something that they have never done, and that is educate all of the children. And we're asking them to do that at a time when resources are too few, when the preparation for education is out of touch with the changing demographics and the needs of families, and when support for public education seems to be at an all-time low, we must figure out a way to invest in our schools and to bring creative minds to grapple with the educational dilemma that America is now facing. Where people live is also making it difficult for children to get out of poverty and connect to opportunity. Very low-income people are living now in areas in which almost everyone else is poor, and this is not as it has always been. One might think that poor people have always lived in poor communities. Actually, poor people have not lived in affluent communities historically, but they have been more equally dispersed in society than they are now, living in areas in which you had more of an economic mix. Now what we have is people who are poor living in areas in which almost everybody else is poor. The thing that's really troubling about that is the isolation that it engenders. Isolation from helping institutions and organizations, isolation from influential individuals who, when they know about the issues, can begin to influence for policies and actions that can make a difference. Isolation from jobs and isolation from natural job networks. And people get jobs because they hear about jobs. When people are isolated from natural job networks, they have really been cut off in an almost complete way from isolation, from opportunity. And part of this isolation really has to be traced back to our failure to deal with issues of race. I often frame the issue of opportunity as a racial challenge. Not just because I'm African American and want to see things improve for African American people, which I certainly do want to see, but I frame it in that context because I'm convinced that if America can deal with the issue of opportunity as it relates to African Americans, it can solve this problem once and for all for everybody. If you solve a problem where it is toughest, the rest will flow. And this issue of color continues to be a basic dilemma in this country. This conversion of race and poverty is seen profoundly in relationship to children and opportunities for children. Child poverty is at an appalling rate in America. 22.1% of all children in the United States are poor. That's in 1992. That's 14.6 million children. But more tragically, 45.6% of black children are poor. And over half of them are living below 1/2 of the poverty level. That is less than $6,000 for a family of 3. Society treats these children like throwaways, and America is learning the hard way that you can't throw children away and expect them not to reappear. They come back again and again in the form of neonatal intensive care costs, in the form of children unprepared to begin school, in the form of children who are not able to get the most out of education because of multiple needs going on in their lives, in the form of young people who have no stake in their neighborhoods, no stake in their broader communities. And unfortunately, we don't have a plan as to how to respond to this. We don't have a plan because we're not asking the right questions. For example, take the issue of teenage pregnancy. I am often asked if I think there is a relationship between welfare payments and teenage pregnancy. It is a difficult question to answer if you rely only on sociological studies, because those studies actually go both ways. Some say yes, some say no. But it's the wrong question. The real issue is, what does it say about society when a 15-year-old girl can look around at her options and having a baby and receiving welfare payments looks like her best bet? Clearly, her opportunities are very limited. We have to take responsibility for changing this. You cannot feel good about a country that routinely locks people out of opportunity that way. And while we don't have a plan, fortunately, we do know a lot about what works. First, in some areas, we need to immediately step up our investments because the returns are just tremendous. Too many babies are born of low birth weight, triggering high expenditures later for health care costs, and every dollar we invest in prenatal care saves 4. Yet many women receive late or no prenatal care. Every dollar we spend on immunization saves 10 in terms of treating preventable diseases. Yet over 40% of 2-year-olds are not fully immunized. And every dollar we spend on Head Start saves $3 in terms of later costs, and yet only 20-25% of children in this country eligible for Head Start are actually getting those services. In addition to stepping up expenditures where we know we can make an immediate difference, we also can make great strides by improving the effectiveness of existing services and transcending the failures of our current system. For example, as long as we are thinking about dealing with poverty by providing safety nets, we are not creating the mechanisms that can deal with the generational cycle of poverty. Let me illustrate from a report prepared by the Urban Strategies Council called Partnership for Change. The report describes a study in which we matched 8,000 students against 19 government programs, things like WIC, AFDC, Child Protective Services. Of the 8,000 students who were all low income, we found that 62% of them were known to at least one program. For more than half of the 8,000 students, those who were known to social service agencies, we were able to add on household members, so we had a rich subset of households of over 4,000. Of those, 82% were known to 2 or more programs, 32% were known to 4 or more programs, and a full 15% were known to 5 or more programs. The primary value of this study was to unveil the discrepancy between needs and the service system that's in place, and it provided a solid foundation about how to make more intelligent policy-making decisions. The data show that multiple, uncoordinated agencies are involved in the lives of the same families. The emphasis is on crisis rather than prevention, and the administrative costs associated with this investment are staggering. It is significant to note that the students who were showing the most difficulty in school, as measured by grade point average, tests on standardized scores, frequent absenteeism, suspensions, were the most likely to be known to programs and the most likely to be known to expensive crisis programs. So contrary to the traditional wisdom that we need to spend safety nets to catch people who are falling through the cracks, we know that people are not falling through the cracks. They're falling into nets. They're falling into nets that aren't really all that safe, but they're allowing people to just dangle. What we need to do is to figure out ways to maximize our investments in people who need those investments most. We need to replace this imagery of safety nets with platforms and ladders that allow people to step up into economic activity that leads to economic self-sufficiency. We need to make sure that the dollars that we're spending really help families and respond to their needs. Our work at the Urban Strategies Council has proven to be very encouraging. It's revealing promising innovations that can make a difference. The mission of the Urban Strategies Council is to reduce the risk of persistent poverty in Oakland through a blend of thought and action and idea and implementation. The staff of the Urban Strategies Council performs a variety of functions in the community. Among them, we gather and analyze and disseminate information related to poverty in order to raise the level of debate and inform policymaking in our community. We convene community organizations, leaders, elected officials, academics, to be able to focus attention on the linkage among a variety of poverty-related issues and the kinds of policies that we need. We convene people so that we can forge informed partnerships and so we can collaborate to tackle these issues. We also perform a service to the community in terms of providing technical assistance and staffing the various programs and systemic change projects so that we can have a sustained effort to make a difference. In the effort to arrive at more effective use of existing resources, we keep driving home the point that we need to listen to families, we need to listen to people who are living in persistent poverty because they have a tremendous amount of wisdom, and we have to figure out ways to tap that wisdom because when they inform the strategies, they tend to be better, they tend to be more responsive, they tend to be more lasting, and people in the community feel a sense of ownership, and it's that ownership that can sustain involvement until real improvement can be seen. We have, through our work, been involved in various initiatives. Sometimes we're involved in programs and creating programs to respond to a particular need. Let me talk about 2 of those. One is something we call the Birth to School Project. Our work to try to expand the effectiveness of early childhood programs showed us that we really needed to take multiple services that are serving the same family and create a continuum from birth to school. And so we worked with the community to identify an area of concentrated poverty, pull together existing programs, and create this holistic continuum, and we call that the Birth to School Project. It exists, it's serving hundreds of families, and the program that we started, which is called the Thurgood Marshall Family Resource Center, has recently gotten a $9 million grant to expand across the city. But we were filling a particular need and used our research and advocacy to do that. Another example there is we started a mentoring center in Oakland. Mentoring is a very important aspect of poverty reduction, connecting adults and caring adults with youth. But most of those programs fail because they're not properly staffed. And so we began a staffing for multiple mentoring programs in Oakland called the Mentoring Center. Sometimes our work endeavors to link efforts dealing with related issues together, so that we have developed school-linked services in Oakland, where we've linked health and social services with schools so that schools can respond to the life circumstances of children. And sometimes our efforts are attempts to reform existing systems, like our work through the Commission for Positive Change in the Oakland Public Schools, where we have focused that system on equity, but we've gone beyond that to really challenge the system, to look deeply into its mechanisms to figure out how it wants to change. We found that one way to really make people squarely face the challenge of equity was to focus them on suspensions, because it's easy to say, yes, we're in favor of educating all the students, but when you look and see what actually happens, many schools take those students who need attention most and they push them away, suspending them, sending a message that we can't deal with you. And so we did a report in which we named names and listed all the schools and put their suspension rates and said, if you're not dealing with this issue, you're not dealing with equity. And while we got a very negative response because people didn't like being called in that way, we have in a respectful manner worked with the schools, and we now are having a real change in the suspensions so that as our reform effort succeeds, those children who need to be in the classrooms are in the classrooms to be able to benefit. Well, despite the many inroads that we've been able to make, there's still some obstacles out there that are very hard to overcome, and I just want to come back and summarize them. First, we find that the systems are fragmented and uncoordinated, serving the same clients without doing so in an effective manner, and disconnected from economic development strategies. You don't ever service people out of poverty. The best that you can do is prepare them to take advantage of opportunity. Therefore, creating opportunity has to be part of the continuum. We must connect people with economic opportunity. Second, there's inadequate funding for the creative process. These are tough issues that we're involved in. And while many of us are well-meaning and we're involved in things that sometimes make us feel very good, if we're not bringing our best creativity and energy to these issues, we are not going to find the solutions that we need. We have to invest in research and evaluation. We have to invest in convening and advocacy. We have to invest in being able to sustain staying out in front of this issue and thinking creatively, and we haven't invested in that. Third, our whole system has an orientation toward crisis and not toward prevention, so that by the time a person is able to attract dollars to him or herself, they're already quite far gone. That when you begin to get family preservation kind of services, it's often because there's already something very devastating happening in the family. When you begin to get the services of youth workers who could help you get on a right track, you've already gotten in trouble with the criminal justice system. We have to move away from not responding to needs until they reach crisis. We need to anticipate needs and have a whole system that focuses on prevention. And finally, we don't really have a mechanism or a plan for being able to take pilot projects to scale. The prevailing attitude continues to be on experimentation rather than on introducing proven pilots to a broader segment of the population and figuring out ways to do that. There are many ways that all of us can contribute to being able to do something about the threat of child poverty and long-term persistent poverty. There are exceptional people in the public interest who are devoting time and energy to combating this. They're making progress, but without adequate input and support from the rest of the community, that progress is bound to be limited. If we're to turn the tide in this country, it requires everybody doing their part. Academics need to stop spending so much time characterizing and describing the behavior of people who are poor and turn their attention to understanding the elements and the characteristics of those strategies that are making a difference and helping to get that word out to others who can utilize it. Government really needs to reform our current system of fragmented services so we can invest coherently in the future of this country. And as citizens, we have to hold our leaders accountable. Business and community leaders need to make their contribution as well. They need to use their influence to help convince the public and elected officials that we need to make investments that are consistent with the rewards that we want. California is dying because of Proposition 13, just dying. It is never going to be the state that it once was, and it's going to be a long time before people are going to even remotely feel good about it again. That was a mistake. We need to get that word out. We need to stop that devastation that's going on in California. We cannot nickel and dime public schools and expect them to produce well-educated, prepared citizens. We cannot expect young people to have a stake in this country if we don't act as if we have a stake in them. The list of possible ways to contribute is endless. The message that I want to convey is that poverty is not somebody else's problem. The children who are suffering are not somebody else's children. Poverty is everybody's problem. The children are everybody's children. To thrive, this country must, again, regain its status as a land of opportunity. And to do that, everybody has to contribute. Thank you.
Your address is a terrific beginning. To start the questioning, we'll have first Joanne Allen and then Brian Goodrich, and then City Club members, please line up at the microphone.
Thank you. Ms. Blackwell, it's interesting you brought up Proposition 13 from California, and I know everyone here in the audience was thinking Measure 5 when you said that. And Measure 5 is basically the same type of proposition that Proposition 13 was. I'm wondering if you could tell us specifically the impact that that has had on children in California.
I'd need another hour. Oh, the impact has been terrible, and we did not feel it for a long time. You know, people passed Proposition 13, and the public interest community said, we will suffer. Children's services will suffer, the public schools will suffer, and we told that story again and again, and people passed Proposition 13 anyway, and year after year after year, it looked like we had all been overreacting, that it wasn't a problem. Now it's all come home to hit, and it's hit hard. We do not have enough money for our schools, and our schools are suffering. California, and when I say schools, I don't just mean K-12. I mean all the way through higher education. California's educational system that used to be the pride of this country is not what it was. The higher education is now just beginning to suffer. It's taking people 5 years to get out of the University of California because the courses aren't offered in a way that allows people to get out in 4. In the public schools, there's so many schools that just don't have the resources that they need. But let me just not even focus on the schools. In our Child Protective Services unit, we're finding that we don't have enough services to even provide anything that looks like prevention. It used to be that you could voluntarily get services from Child Protective Services if you thought you had a problem in your family. You can't do that anymore. The only time you can get those services is if there's a serious problem that's been reported, and so there's no prevention anymore. In our juvenile probation used to have a ratio of 200 to 1. Just this past year. It's now been cut in half, and the ratio will be 400 to 1. A few years ago, it was 75 to 1. Now, with a ratio of 400 to 1, we have no probation system, right? We have to rethink probation because you can't do anything with that. I could go on and on, but I won't. We have been devastated by Proposition 13, and not only is it it's keeping us from having the resources we need, but we can't get out of it because it was coupled with a requirement that said you had to have a 2/3 vote in order to raise any new taxes, in order to change it. So it means that a small minority of people, many of whom don't have children, perhaps don't even care that much about children, are able to keep us from getting the resources that we need. Over 60% of the population voted to get rid of it, but that's not 2/3, so we didn't get rid of it. So we're in serious trouble, and it saddens me to think that another state might be going down that same road.
Ms. Blackwell, another question on resources. The investments that you talk about in children, the value of those are clear, but we also hear about the need for investments in law enforcement and environmental issues, and there's certainly the need for investments in the poverty-stricken savings and loan industry. It's a terrible condition. How do we get a grip on the priorities? How do we set priorities to deal with children's issues when there are certainly other legitimate priorities out there that also need investment of limited public resources?
Let me leave the savings and loan one alone for a minute, though, though I think that really creative minds that understand that system could see how maybe the answer fits the same as the answer I'm about to give. When you talk about law enforcement and environment, which are things that I know more about, I don't see any tension between the three. That we need to figure out ways to really holistically respond to all of those. Children are indeed our future. We know that we must invest in children. If law enforcement needs are increasing, it's because we have failed to invest in children. That very often we find that the very young people who cause us to have to increase our investment in law enforcement are the young people who we have disinvested from all along. So the two are really related. We will never have enough money to fight the crisis at the level at which we're feeding into the crisis by not investing in prevention. That, for example, if we think we're going to keep building up police and keep building up jails and keep not investing in health and early childhood and school and healthy outlets for young people, we're just not going to have enough money to do that, so we need to stop and say, how can we step back and stop this tide? So I think the two are related in that way. But also, as we invest in law enforcement, you all understand community policing here. I know that Portland's really been a leader there. Community policing is a way to invest in children at the same time that we're investing in law enforcement. And we need to find other creative ways to do that. So if we say children are our most important asset for the future, anything that we do, the litmus test should be, how are we going to do this investment in this new thing so that we also are maximizing opportunities for children. And I'll bet you if we think about savings and loan and what they ought to be doing and the kind of communities they ought to be building and the kind of businesses they ought to be investing in and neighborhoods they ought to be investing in, we could find out that we could use those dollars to enhance opportunities as well.
My name is Barbara Clark. I'd like you to say more about improvements in the schools because the demography of our Measure 5 limitation vote was the people who said, yeah, limit it, were people who were not educated. And the people who were paying the highest property taxes were not the precincts where the limitation passed emphatically. So it wasn't a simple matter of people voting their wallets, in my opinion, but you have low-income neighborhoods of poorly educated people who say the school system isn't worth supporting.
Well, maybe it is people voting their wallets because I think that people are willing to pay when they see a benefit. And I find in talking to people that those who live in more affluent neighborhoods actually see more benefit from their public schools than those people who live in less affluent neighborhoods. So that very often people who are low income are voting their wallets when they say, I'm not paying any more taxes because I'm not seeing any return. And rather than thinking about needing to educate them to see how the broader society good benefits them as well, we need to begin to show that the broader society good benefits them as well. So that I really try to get people, when they think about school reform, to think about focusing mostly on those schools in low-income neighborhoods. If we have few dollars, let's not scatter them across every place, but let's say, where are our schools really suffering the most, and investing in those schools. I also think we have to do a job of education. And the job of education is one to get people involved in the political and the governance process so people feel that they are making decisions, so they see their decisions being reflected in what actually happens. So I've got two responses. One is we need to make sure that people really feel that they can have some impact on how their dollars are spent, because by feeling that they have an impact, they have more of a stake. And they also need to see some return and see that the broader society values them too. Though in California, I don't think that the pattern that you've described has necessarily been the pattern. We found that people often were using private schools and not that interested in public school, and in lots of neighborhoods where people had few children, there was little interest in the schools. But I could see it working the other way as well.
You mentioned that, Dan Goldie, member of the club, you mentioned that very important to coordinate with these various social programs dealing with the direct symptoms that you're discussing, the economic development programs of local communities. And we're all aware of the fact that California is suffering serious problems in their economy, problems that we may be seeing for different reasons, but in acute form right here in Oregon very shortly. My question is, to what degree is the economic development programs of local communities like Oakland being tied in with these social programs? How do you do it? And are you seeing any results so that there is a ladder of opportunity out of poverty for these people?
Unfortunately, I think the realization that we have to tie the two together is a recent one. I mean, it is an obvious statement once one says it, that you have to not only prepare people for opportunity, you have to connect them to opportunity. But we haven't been seeing much of that. In Oakland, we are beginning to do it. We're beginning to do it with schools, that as we're linking health and social services with schools, we also are looking at ways to link in economic development opportunities by having access to job training programs right there, by trying to encourage the nexus between school and work, that transition, and to start that early. So we're seeing those things happen. There's great receptivity. Also, several foundations have understood that this blend has to be there, and foundations are beginning to help local communities think about how to join the two together. There is a legal services backup unit in Oakland called the National Economic Development Law Center. We have gotten them to work directly with us as we're working with heads of various agencies to present and help develop strategies for doing it. So I don't think that I have a lot to report, though there are a few exemplary things happening around the country, but I can report that the commitment is there and the resources are coming to be able to explore some ways, and I think that's going to be real fruitful in the future.
Mark Rosenbaum, City Club member. Tell me, in view of the fact that most of the programs we're talking about are not self-sufficient, how do you take a pilot project and move it successfully into broader scale usage and give it some kind of secure funding base?
This is our constant challenge. I'll give you a couple examples of being able to do that. One is this Birth to School project that I talked about. What we did with the Birth to School project was we created a new concept, and that is holistic support in an area of concentrated poverty from birth to school. We took 4 publicly funded programs that are going to be going on: community health clinic, a Head Start program, a parent-child center, and a state-funded case management center for teen parents. So they already were programs that were being sustained. We pulled them together to be the project. What we avoided was creating a new program. We took things that were already there. We did raise some new money, but it was to help them to learn how to work together, not necessarily to do anything differently. And I think that's one way to do it, that when you want to start a pilot project, to try to pull publicly funded and ongoing programs and try to change their nature rather than creating something new. Another way is in our work dealing with schools and trying to connect social services with schools, we have begun to outstation those workers who decide whether or not people are eligible to receive welfare. We decided to take them out of the welfare office and put them in the school. What we found out when we put them in the school, and this is just in two schools, was that they were doing a better job of actually securing eligibility and that they were speeding up the process quite a bit so that they were working actually more effectively and efficiently than the same workers who were placed in the downtown office. And so even though we are not completely satisfied with our efforts to integrate social services with schools, we see that there is one thing here that we don't need to wait on. This makes sense. It makes sense for everybody involved. Let's begin to take that to scale and do it all across the county and not just in these two areas. I think that's another way to do it. A third way to do it is that when we begin to develop new things that we think we want to institutionalize, to spend the time evaluating those things so that we'll have the ammunition that we need to be able to get public support and not just let the small group of people who had the good fortune to come in contact with those programs be the only ones who know about it. So I think that's another way to be able to make a difference.
In the ongoing, I'm Bill Crane, City Club member and on the program committee. In the ongoing conundrum of how we take care of children and how we create a new paradigm of making good things for them, from what I read in the papers and so forth, it seems that women are getting a lot more responsibility than the men are, that mothers have tougher jobs than fathers do. The Time magazine has a great cover article this week about that. I wonder if you could say something about responsibilities and opportunities for women and responsibilities and opportunities for men in taking care of children.
I think the most important thing that we need to be concerned about is not who's taking care of the children, but that whomever is doing it has adequate support. That is both in terms of salary support, that the problem with women maintaining families is not that those families are maintained by women, but that those women very often don't have access to salaries that are the same as men. And so because a woman is alone, it's very likely that that family might live in poverty. So I'm very excited about things like expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit, because I think that that really makes a difference to begin to even out the differences. Also, in terms of health benefits and things like that, we need to look there. We also need to pay attention to child care. Whomever is taking care of children really ought to have a safe, affordable place to leave children, and so we need to develop that so that I like not to frame this issue in terms of men and women, but what any person taking care of children ought to have access to, and a person taking care of children ought to have access to that, whether it's a man or a woman. I think there are lots of issues that have to do within the home and who takes responsibility and the way employers respond to the caretaking responsibilities of their employees, and we need to make sure that we get those discussions out into the public arena so that people don't have to deal with them personally in a lonely sort of way, whether we're talking about people talking about their challenges at home or their challenges in the workplace. This needs to be a public discussion so people can get that kind of support. But rather than make it personal, I like to think about the kind of policy and society things that acknowledge that it takes time to raise children, and we need to make sure people have that time. It takes money to raise children, and it takes support to raise children.
Bob Wheels, City Club member. Lots of Californians are leaving the state. Some of them are even coming to Oregon. But there's a lot of immigration, particularly foreign immigration. What is the effect of these new masses of people on those already in poverty, on the school system, on the welfare system?
Extraordinarily harsh. The impact is harsh on the state because they don't have the resources. It's harsh on those who are coming in because they're not being well served. That the dynamics that are happening in California are so instructive for the rest of the nation because we're just a step or two ahead of everybody else. Everybody's going to feel it. In terms of people leaving, one of my co-workers said that she is frequently getting calls from friends calling up and asking, where are you moving? Not are you moving, but just where are you moving? Trying to coordinate to make sure friends can stay close to each other, because the assumption is one would not stay in California given what's happening if you had a choice. It's really happening. But at the same time that people who can move out are moving out, we do have this tremendous influx of people who need support services, who need social services, who need the kind of integrated support that we've been talking about, and it is not there for them, and there is not the political will to provide it. Because many of the people who are voting, who can make those kind kind of decisions are feeling a resentment about the newcomers who need support rather than feeling, how do we make this work for everybody? And we better take the attitude of how do we make this work for everybody, because this is the future. The schools are facing this challenge most profoundly right now in terms of the need for bilingual services, integrating a social structure with education in order to make sure that the newcomers are able to get what they need to be productive as they grow up. But no, California's not handling it very well, but a lot of us there know that this is the challenge and that we are doing the country a favor in facing this challenge, because the whole country is going to face it.
I'm Herb Crane, a member. I have a question that I've wanted to ask a City Club speaker for years, and I never had the nerve. I'm going to do it with you. Given the tremendous shortage of funds in the school system that we are currently facing and which will increase, and given the fact that TAG children, talented and gifted, would presumably, in fact actually are, far better prepared to face the world on their own, is it not counterproductive to spend the money that we spend on TAG programs rather than on putting those funds in the very threatened area that you're discussing?
It's interesting that you've asked that question. I've not been asked that question before, though I talk about it even when people don't ask me. I agree with you in a sense. I agree with you that it doesn't make sense to put our extraordinary resources, our extra resources, and when I say extraordinary, I don't just mean money, I mean people, because we often take our most talented teachers and put them with the gifted students as well. That doesn't make sense because those students are the most likely to make it. But what we find out, and this is where I don't agree with you, what we find out is that those programs really are the educational programs that everybody needs. It actually is an example of a pilot program that's been going on for scores of years. It is a pilot program that shows that stimulating education that is interactive really does prepare people for the future. We have proven it. We have proven it again and again and again. We need to take it to scale so that I don't regret that we have been developing these programs. We now need to make them available to everybody. That's what education ought to be. We need to stop isolating that with a very few and make sure that all the students have access to stimulation. I mean, why would any student want to be in a class that's not stimulating? You know, so I'm for going with it.
Perhaps I'll take advantage of the lull while someone else steps to the speaker. But I have another question I wanted to ask. I think a lot of the emphasis has been on public programs and public financing. Can you give us some hope of ways of leveraging private involvement in solving these problems so that it doesn't just become a governmental responsibility?
Thank you for asking that, because I certainly don't think it's just a governmental responsibility. I pay a lot of attention to government because that's where the big dollars are, and so we have to make sure that we're using those programs well. But this is everybody's issue. I think that private dollars, foundation dollars really have been extraordinarily helpful in terms of helping us find out things that work. I think that dollars from individuals are also helpful to be able not only to support programs, but to help hold programs accountable. When the public really gives, the public can find that through its giving, it's able to turn programs in directions of things that the public say, we like that. We like that you're serving these groups. We like that you're working in that way. Also, volunteers are extremely important. I don't think that we've utilized volunteers very well in this country at all. We don't train them, we don't support them, we don't provide opportunities for them to interact with each other, and we need to really get serious about being able to train, support, and utilize volunteers very effectively. It's one of the things I love about the program in Atlanta that President Carter has started, the Atlanta Project. He really is pioneering there in terms of effective use of volunteers, in terms of community revitalization. Also, in terms of the private sector, I think that we can do a lot more with our influence than we have done in the past. We need to really educate ourselves and utilize the media to educate others. We need to write to the media, we need to work with the media so that we can begin a conversation in this country that maybe is going to help us get into the future intact. And I think that it's up to the public to force the media to go in that direction as well. So I think there's a lot to do with the private sector to make these changes.
Ms. Blackwell, we hear a lot about the responsibility of people to pay taxes and on and be supportive of these kind of programs. My question for you is, the public appears to be just really frustrated with government in general. I mean, anything that government is doing cannot be good at this particular point. How do we, number one, get the confidence back into government, but number two, make government accountable to the people who they're supposed to be serving?
The answer, I guess, is the same to both. We can build confidence in government by government demonstrating that it can do a better job. And we can build accountability by people helping to define what that better job is, and then making sure that that happens. I have been thinking recently a lot about democracy, because in addition to the crisis that I talked about in terms of poverty, we seem to have a serious crisis of democracy. And because people don't seem invested. They don't seem to care about it. It seems to be something over there. To just let a few people make these kind of decisions. Democracy, that seemed to be so much a bedrock for this community, seems to be an afterthought for many people, and that's wrong. And I think we really need to focus on how to re-engage at the local level, people taking responsibility for their fellow citizens and taking responsibility for holding a government accountable to responding to those local needs. Democracy will not be re-energized at the national level. It will be re-energized from many local levels. And so I'm interested not only in town meetings. Town meetings are a gloss. They're okay, but they're a gloss. They don't go very deep. I think what we really have to do is to go in the neighborhoods where people are and provide the support that they need to be able to understand their neighborhoods, to be able to create plans and vision for their neighborhoods, and then work with all of those people in and outside of their neighborhoods to be able to realize. I think that's the kind of shot in the arm that democracy needs in order for people to be able to begin to then spread that involvement to broader levels, broader geographic levels. So government's got to do a better job, but government's not going to do a better job till we define what that job ought to be and join with them in terms of doing it. And the local level is the place to be able to make that difference.
Alan Oliver, City Club member. One of the reasons that President Clinton gave for withdrawing Lonnie Guinier's nomination was her supposed concept of democracy, or what he found in her writings that indicated to him an anti-democratic approach. What do you think that withdrawal of the nomination implies for this administration in terms of civil rights and some of the issues that you've been talking about?
Oh. That's so complicated, isn't it? What does it imply? It implies that this country needs to have a conversation about race. I actually was in a meeting, fortunate enough to be in a meeting with Bill Moyers last week, and we were talking about this, and I was having the conversation with him because I think if anybody can involve America in a conversation, Bill Moyers is a person who has the kind of access to do so. But we need to have a conversation about race. We're afraid of it. We don't like to talk about it, and we're not going to move forward until we have it. The Lonnie Guinier situation showed how uncomfortable we are talking about it. I mean, my personal belief is that our president really did believe in his nominee, but what he was reacting to was whether the country was ready to have this conversation. More specifically, whether the country was able to have this conversation in July, because that's when we would have been having it. And I think he made a judgment that we weren't ready for it. I think we need to have it. We need to have it in July, we need to have it in December, we need to have it in March, we need to have it. And all of us need to begin to talk with our friends and neighbors about the fact that we may differ, but democracy is in a crisis. And we don't seem to be able to get out of it with the voting arrangement that we now have. So we need to talk at least. Maybe we don't need to institute new ways, but we need to talk about them. And we need to talk about why certain people are pursuing them and why there are large sectors of the community that are willing to support them. So the whole withdrawal was a sad thing to happen, and I think it seriously hurt the president with the civil rights community. And I think that it sent a message across this country that America's not ready. And, I think people heard that. Well, America better get ready. We need to have that conversation.
Don Barney, City Club member. You talked at the beginning about the problem of isolation and the racial problem, and we're not doing well with those. Saw a movie the other night called Menace to Society, in which a picture of a young black male in Los Angeles growing up in a situation where there is the impact of isolation in the community, in effect, no ties in terms of dealing with drugs, dealing with the negative parts of the community. Have you seen any ways to intervene in that cycle in terms of children in families anywhere in the country that are facing that difficult pattern and difficult environment that they're in, of moving in there, short of trying to pull the child out of that situation?
I have a 23-year-old son who told me that I should see that movie. I'll see. There are two ways to approach it. One is to say that the isolation has to be dealt with by breaking it up. And there certainly are examples that can be effective. There's the Gautreaux experiment in Chicago, which many of you may know about, where public housing was built in an area outside of the community in a more suburban kind of environment. And people found that over time, looking at that experiment, that it really did make a difference in terms of school performance and a multitude of other issues in terms of the lives of young people. So we know that sometimes we can make a difference by being able to just pick people up and move them to another environment. Query, though, when you go through that, whether or not that's a long-term solution, because we know that in the communities that are low-income communities of color now, there was a time when there were just a few people in that community, but that what happened was as the numbers began to grow, other people began to flee, and the community changed. When numbers get larger, what would happen in those communities? But we know that is a strategy that we need to do other places. We need to find out more about it. While we're pursuing that strategy, we need to look at the examples of being able to revitalize communities that already exist. There are some examples of this going on. There's the Sandtown project in Baltimore that I think is really taking a community that has historically been a low-income community, and by investing heavily, it's the Enterprise Foundation that's doing this one, they really are making a difference. There's a project in Los Angeles called the Excel Project, in which a private developer has developed low-income housing in a very low-income neighborhood in Los Angeles, and this housing is completely self-contained. There are no windows on the outside. The windows are on the inside, looking out onto a courtyard. In the courtyard, there is a play area that is very nice, very well developed, very expansive for the children. That is where the children play. All of the children go to one school, and there is a whole parent organization from the housing development that works directly with the school. This Excel project, I think it only serves about 50 families, but the results are very impressive when you look at that as one way to go. Cleveland, Ohio has developed a whole concept of building villages, taking low-income communities, thinking of them as villages, looking at the assets in the village, the school, the grandparents, the churches, the small businesses, all of which are assets, and trying to figure out how to revitalize that community from an asset orientation. Let me just say a word about that. That what we have typically done in this country is we look at the deficits of individuals and people, and then we respond to the deficits. It's not the way we would solve problems as individuals. If we have problems, we say, okay, here's the problem. Then you look and say, what have I got to work with? And the rest of your focus is on the positives, the strengths, what you have to work with. In low-income communities, the issue and the focus continues to always be on the deficits. And those of us who are involved in community building really are trying to move away from that and begin to build on strengths. If we can build on strengths in the communities, we may be able to revitalize the communities and change the environment sufficiently so that people move to other neighborhoods because they want to, not because they have to in order to survive.
Angela Blackwell, it's been a real privilege to have you grace our podium. I think your vision and leadership give us some hope that we can address these daunting problems. Please join me in thanking Angela Blackwell. We're adjourned. We're adjourned.